Hey guys, welcome to my brand new YouTube channel which we've set up to assist you guys studying for your A-level, GCSE, politics and sociology syllabuses. What we're going to be doing is providing you with insights in how to ace the exams, how to get an A star in your essays or a 9 if you're doing GCSE, and also provide you top exam tips in how to write the best essays in time-constrained conditions, making sure that you secure the best grade possible for yourself. So, first of all, I wanted to introduce you to our channel mascot, who is Suki, who I think is sleeping right now, but we will wake her up just to introduce her. So this is Suki, the pom. The reason we're introducing her is because she might start barking during the video once we go on into political ideologies, which I don't think she really likes listening to. So yeah, I thought we'll let you know that she's here in the background and she will be rooting for us and our channel as we release our videos. So we're going to put Suki back onto the floor so she can rest again, and hopefully my ramblings will not lead her to go to sleep, and she'll be watching just as you guys will be throughout the entire video. I think the best starting point for studying the ideologies would be to look at conservatism. So for this video, we'll be studying the conservative ideology and we'll be looking at it through the lens of the thinkers. So as you know, for the specification, they want you to know the ideologies through the understandings of how the thinkers have made sense of them. And the thinkers are so important because Edexcel, for example, will limit you to a band 2 if you do not reference the thinkers in your essay. And that means the maximum mark you can get is just 9 out of 24. So beginning on conservatism. Conservatism is split up into 3 schools. So we have traditional conservatism, which emerged as a reaction to the Enlightenment during the 18th century. It promulgated that pragmatism, having a practical approach to dealing with politics, and empiricism alongside tradition were vital to maintaining society in its extant form. The second school we'll be looking at is One-Nationism. That was developed during the late 19th century and further evolved during the 20th. It supported a considerable more amount of interference in both society and the economy on behalf of the state in order to better preserve society. The final school of conservatism that we'll be looking at is the New Right. This emerged during the 1970s, and it was a marriage between neo-liberalism and neo-conservatism, essentially arguing that one-nationism had gone too far in terms of its expansion of the state. This had led to individuals becoming highly dependent upon the state, creating a dependency culture, as it was called, and conservatives would now have to make sure that the state was essentially rolled back to make sure that it returned to its traditional roots. So, as promised, we'll be looking at this through each individual thinker. The first thinker I want to introduce you to is Thomas Hobbes. Now, Thomas Hobbes published a book known as the Leviathan, which was written at the end of the English Civil War, published in 1651. Now, the Leviathan set out to derogate the chaos and anarchy that resulted because of the English Civil War and help individuals to understand the importance of stability and order in society, which is the crux of conservatism. This is probably what keeps conservatives awake at night, making sure that society is stable and orderly. So, the way that I would help you understand what each thinker is saying is by looking through 3 key lenses: state, society, and the economy. And this is a default way of actually structuring your paragraphs in your A-level essays. If you're not sure what to write about when talking about the ideologies, your default should be to talk about the state in one paragraph, the society in another, and the economy in the third. Human nature often also comes up, but I usually request that students combine that with the society paragraph. So to start off with, let's seek to understand what Hobbes thought of human beings in terms of their nature. So Hobbes is basically saying that human beings are imperfect. He believes they are rationally, morally, and intellectually flawed. saying they have a relentless desire to acquire goods and self-gratification, creating a society where existence would essentially be anarchic and horrible. He even describes it as a hellish, chaotic world of constant warfare. In another part of the Leviathan, he says that life during this period, whereby humans did not have recourse to a state, was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, Hobbes believes that during human existence, the state wasn't always there. There was a period whereby the state did not exist, and he calls this the state of nature. Now, during these videos, many a times we'll be mentioning a lot of important keywords. Now, keywords are very much essential to making sure that you get a band 5 and top marks in your essays. And I think of keywords as actually magnets that draw in your essay, making sure it's coherent, easily readable, and of a high caliber level. So when you are revising, make sure that you memorize the key words that are associated with each individual thinker and each ideology, because that will guarantee that you get top marks. So what is the state of nature? So the state of nature, he says, existed before society and the state actually emerged. It was a horrible place to be. Why? Because there was no recourse to justice. There was no real freedom. There was no real rights. And this meant that if, for example, somebody killed you, those that loved you that were left behind had no recourse to justice. If somebody stole from you, you couldn't take them to court. If somebody was to attack you, you could not ring the police. There was no institutions that were available to create justice, order, and stability. And this is what he called, as we said earlier, the state of nature. Keyword. Now, he said, whilst these humans were in the state of nature, whilst they were irrational, whilst they were seeking their own gratification, they still had an inkling of rationality. They weren't completely written off by Hobbes. And this inkling of rationality in their brains led them to want to seek order. So they thought to themselves, you know what? This type of living is not conducive to our well-being. Let's seek order. And the way we're going to do that is by creating a social contract. Another key word. This social contract would exist between the ruled, i.e. the people, and the ruler. This will lead to the establishment of what Hobbes described as an all-powerful sovereign. The all-powerful sovereign would rule in the interests of the people and guarantee two main things. Number one, defending the realm. So if the country or the state was invaded, the all-powerful sovereign would raise an army to defend it, so you would be protected. Number two, to uphold the law, the rule of law. Now this is vitally important because if somebody was to fall into a contract with you, make a contract with you, and then break that agreement, you could take them to court and find recourse to justice with the all-powerful sovereign. Now, part of the social contract actually included giving up your individual autonomy, individual rights and freedoms to this all-powerful sovereign. And the social contract, Hobbes said, would only be complete once that process had completed. When all your individual autonomy, all your freedoms and all your rights were given to the sovereign. So they alone decided what your rights were. So Hobbes had to deal with a contention now. Now that contention was, well, why would we even want to create such a state, a system of existence, a society, whereby I have to give up all my individual rights and freedoms to an all-powerful sovereign? Well, Hobbes argued back. He said, well, hold up a minute. These freedoms and rights that you talk about, they would be worthless in the state of nature anyway. What freedom is there if somebody can come and kill you and there is no recourse to justice? If somebody can come and steal from you and you can't do nothing about it? If somebody can invade the country and nobody will defend you? Is that really a place where you can argue you have freedom and you have liberty? Rather, he says it would be better that if we do give up those freedoms and autonomies to the all-powerful sovereign, at least then we do have some entrenched freedoms. The freedom to do what we want in an environment that is protected, in a sphere that the sovereign is responsible for. So that's what Hobbes wants to create. And he sees this as a sensible solution to removing the anarchical state of nature and actually creating an environment where everyone can live and flourish and live the good life, effectively. Now, It's interesting because Hobbes actually goes further and says that the sovereign themselves are not actually bound by the social contract, meaning the people need to be obedient to the sovereign, and the sovereign in return should maintain order. But the sovereign themselves is not bound by any law and is free to govern as they see fit. Now this raises the second contention. Hobbes deals with this also, but people might say, well, hold on a minute. If we're giving up all power and authority and rights and freedoms to this all-powerful sovereign, what if that sovereign then turns around and becomes a tyrant? What if he starts killing his own people? What if he becomes a dictator, an autocratic monarch that nobody can tell what to do? What about then? So Hobbes turns around and says, well, you know what? That's a possibility. But why would the sovereign, even want to do that? Why would he want to become a dictator? Because then the people would rebel. They would turn around and say, well, look, the whole point of putting you into power was so that you look after us, so that we don't retreat back into the state of nature, so we don't kill each other, so we don't attack each other, so we can live in peace. But now you're producing those same terrible circumstances that we were living in before. What's the point of even having you now? So he says the people would withdraw the sovereignty they've given to the sovereign. So it'd be foolish for him to even do that. So Hobbes finds a way of excusing himself from that argument. Now, it's also important to remember that Hobbes didn't actually see the emergence of the all-powerful sovereign as being a particular incident within history. Rather, he said it was a hypothesis almost, a best way to understand how the state actually emerged. There wasn't a particular period in history where you could say, oh, well, this was the time when the sovereign emerged and started to wield power. So effectively, if we're looking at the state, society, and the economy, what is Hobbes saying? Just a quick overview. So for society, he's saying society should be structured whereby the all-powerful sovereign exists and rules in favor of the people. Society did not exist before the emergence of the state. What does the state look like for Hobbes? Well, the state is highly authoritative. Its ultimate role is to uphold the rule of law and prevent invasion of the realm, defend the country. In terms of the economy, Hobbes is pretty much laissez-faire, free market. He doesn't really believe that the economy could even exist prior to the existence of the state and society. In terms of human nature, finally, he has a very pessimistic, negative outlook on human nature. So that's a brief overview of Hobbes. Hobbes very much fits into the traditional conservative school. The next key thinker we're going to be looking at is Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was born in 1729. He died in 1797, so an 18th century thinker. The book that Burke wrote was The Reflections on the Revolution in France, and that was published in 1790. And as is stated in the title, it was his understanding of the French Revolution, and he argued that it was a terrible incident, that it shouldn't have happened, and it was something that led to anarchy and chaos in the French state. Now, you're probably wondering, well, what school does Edmund Burke fall into? Is he a traditional conservative, or are we now moving into the One-Nation school? Well, Edmund Burke actually has elements of thought that fit into both schools. He's somewhat a traditionalist, but some of his ideas are also one-nationist. Let's look at his main ideas. Burke argued that political power does not give those in charge the right to remodel society on some sort of abstract or untested blueprint that had never been tried before. He said rather those that are in power, i.e. the politicians and the rulers, should be mindful of the society that they inherited and that their duty extends to preserving that society for their descendants. Let me explain that. Edmund Burke effectively believed that society was a contract between the dead, so those who have passed away before us, the living, so us, and those that are to be born, so our children, our successors. Now, he believed society was something that was given to us based upon accreted wisdom. What do we mean by accreted wisdom? Well, the intelligence and the policy of our forefathers. What he's saying is that because human beings are imperfect, just as Hobbes was saying, rationally, morally, and intellectually, we don't really know how society should be structured. So the way that we should structure our society and organize it should be predicated upon what our ancestors did, what those who have gone before us did. And that was the safest way, the safest bet you could hedge upon actually structuring a society, because it's something that we know works. The problem with abstract ideas, if you're wondering what abstract is, it's something that doesn't really exist in reality. It's just an idea that we might have. For example, we might say that nobody in society should be poor. But then we might ask ourselves, well, has that ever actually happened in society? Or is this an abstract utopian ideal, a perfect ideal that has never really had a root in pragmatic and practical society, in tangible reality? So Burke is saying we should base our policy predicated largely upon the past, because this is an inherited tradition based upon the wisdom of our ancestors. Now, he also says, though, society is organic, so he's not completely a reactionary. A reactionary is an individual who wants to maintain society exactly as it was in the past and maintain that in its current form and also for the future. He says actually society is organic. Now, the word organic actually relates a lot to functionalist ideology and the school of thought which relates to sociology. So I know a lot of you students who are doing politics A-level also study sociology. Burke's ideology is somewhat similar to the functionalist school in sociology, because he's saying that, look, society is made up of a number of institutions. For example, we've got education, we've got religion, we've got the state, we've got the media, for example, and all of these are working together to maintain society. But over time, they may change. So he establishes this principle of change to conserve, so that society can change, and if it fundamentally does change, it should be guided by pragmatism, tradition, history, and above all, empiricism. What that means is that society does change, according to Burke, but if we are going to make those changes, they need to be very, very subtle. They need to be done very, very gradually, and they need to be done very, very slowly. And the reason we do them is to preserve existing institutions. And I've got a great example of when that actually took place quite recently. We refer back to the Same-Sex Marriage Act 2013. Now, the Same-Sex Marriage Act was policy that the Conservative government put forward to legalize same-sex marriage. The reason it did that was that society had changed to such an extent whereby individuals now believed that marriage between people of the same sex was no longer an issue. And I think this is a really good example because fundamentally what was being preserved was the institution of marriage. Historically, the institution of marriage was always kind of understood to be between man and woman. But because society changed so significantly in the modern day, it's not a problem for most people in society to accept that marriage can take place between two men or two women. So the government introduced the Same-Sex Marriage Act to adopt to changes in society whilst preserving an institution that was effectively timeless, the institution of marriage. And it successfully did that by incorporating a novel way of understanding an old institution. And this would be a perfect example of change to conserve. Burke also believed that modern states were extremely complex, and trying to reform them based upon any rational and idealistic policies would be hugely problematic. Reason being because they were never tested. They were abstract. They were philosophical. We don't know if these are actually going to work. So he kind of described these as philosophical abstractions when he was talking about the Jacobins or the French revolutionaries. He even said that politics ought to be adjusted, not to human reasoning, but to human nature, of which reason is but a part, but to no means the greatest part. Now, what that effectively means is that if we are going to create policy, human reason should be a small part of it, but not the absolute part of it, because human reason is flawed. So the best way to create a state is to root it in the past, based upon tradition, custom, heritage, accreted wisdom, as we mentioned earlier. And it's exactly why he was so antithetical to the French Revolution, because he was saying that these French revolutionaries, they were trying to establish principles that was so radical, that was so novel, that was so neoteric, that they had no fundamental background in anything that had happened in history. Now, this is quite interesting because Burke was actually supportive of the American Revolution. So why is Burke supportive of the American Revolution but not the French Revolution? The answer is quite simple. Because the American Revolution did not seek to undo history, tradition, and custom. It wanted to establish a new political order, but it did not do so by trashing the existing order. It wanted to build upon it. But the French were very different. They wanted to remove the extant order, completely do away with it and start something new. That's why Burke saw the French revolutionaries as a problem, but not the American revolutionaries. A very good point of analysis for your examination. But just like Hobbes though, Burke definitely viewed society as hierarchical. And while he argued that society's elites had specific duties, he opposed any attempts to extend the franchise and thought that universal suffrage would lead to mob rule. And this is quite interesting. Burke is very much in favor of hierarchical society. He says that society is naturally hierarchical and that governance should not be done through sortition or drawing of lots. He didn't believe that, everyone's name should just be put into a hat and then we draw out names and say, oh, look, Suki can now govern just because she's, let's say Suki was a human being. She can now govern just because we've drawn out her name. He wasn't absolutely democratic in that fashion. He did believe that certain individuals were brought up to rule, for example, in the way that they were taught, their education, for example, their background, their mannerisms. These were very important for Burke and fundamentally influenced the way that that individual would then go on to govern. So he wasn't absolutely pro-democracy in that sense. And he even thought that if everyone got the vote, this would lead to mob rule. It would sweep away the intellectual class or the aristocratic class, which of course he was a part of. So he felt like that was a problem and wasn't really advocating for that. Burke's ideas, of course, were very influential for traditional conservatism, but also one-nation conservatism. In particular, his belief that society is not organic and that it should change to conserve society was for Burke not static and stagnant. It was constantly evolving. So those are Burke's ideas. In terms of thinkers and ideologies and schools, it very much fits into, I think, both the traditional and the one-nation school. We swiftly move on to looking at Michael Oakeshott. Michael Oakeshott was born in 1901 at the turn of the 20th century and died near its end in 1990. Now, the book he wrote was actually it's an essay. It was on being conservative and it was published in 1956. Oakeshott still, I would say, very much also fits into the traditional and the one-nationist school. Oakeshott starts by arguing that conservatism is as much a disposition as it is a set of political ideas. He says that the security of long-standing traditions, customs, is at the core of his ideological understanding. What do we mean it's a disposition? Well, Oakeshott is saying it's not just your political ideology. It's not just how you think politics should be done. It's everything about you. It's the way you conduct yourself, the way you dress, the way you educate yourself, the way you look after yourself, the way you communicate with other people, the way you interact with society and the rest of the community. Conservatism influences everything that you do. One of the key phrases that is put forward by Oakeshott is the politics of faith. Just like Hobbes and Burke, he believes that rationalism, rational and logical thinking, is beyond the capacity of human beings. So he says, as this is the case, human beings should trust in the politics of faith, whereby decision-making is grounded in empiricism and not rationalism. Meaning, we should base our political policy upon past precedent, but also empirical value. What do we mean by empiricism? Empiricism just means something that is tangible and real, not abstract. When we're talking about abstract ideals, they're very philosophical, they're very ethereal, out of this world maybe, not really rooted in reality. But when we're being empirical and pragmatic, we're pretty much talking about things that are tangible and real, that are actually happening. And he said our politics should be based upon that. Let's not be too idealistic, Oakeshott says. Now, he said the government should govern in the best interests of the people. This should be grounded in pragmatism and empiricism and not be guided by abstract understandings and concepts of what should be. The government shouldn't say to itself, we should establish a society whereby everyone has a house, when nobody is homeless. They should first ask themselves, can this actually be done? Can we actually create this society? Can it actually be funded? If the answer is yes, and it has some sort of precedent in history, then by all means go ahead. But if the answer is no, then you should be somewhat reticent and cautious, lest, he says, you establish a society and create something that is worse than what already existed. This is why he also argued for the politics of skepticism, another key phrase. He said the implementation of abstract ideas often leads to unintended consequences. He says rationalists who think of society in a very logical, coherent way tend to underestimate that society is very complex indeed, particularly now that it's multifaceted. When we look at modern society, economies are integrated, markets are integrated, we have globalization, you have the mass movement of people and commodity. Because of this, everything is very complex. So let's not get ahead of ourselves and try to establish a new society when something that we know works is already in play and is doing a fine job. We have order and stability, which is the ultimate goal of states and the establishment of society. Oakeshott warns us to be mindful that when trying to make improvements, the cure is not worse than the disease. So effectively what he's saying there is that when we are applying new policy, we want to make sure that this new thing that we're trying to implement, which we think will make society better, doesn't actually make things worse. So he is very skeptical and he is very cautious, just like any conservative is. So that was Oakeshott's work. Now he very much fits into the One-Nationist school, but also with elements of traditionalism, as we said with Edmund Burke. Now, let me explain a bit more about what One-Nationism is all about. Now, another thinker that is actually drawn up, not within the specification, but within a lot of textbooks, is Benjamin Disraeli. Now, Benjamin Disraeli was a former British Prime Minister, and he wrote a book called Sybil. Now, in that book, he said that Britain was becoming a very dichotomized society, one for the rich and one for the poor. And he saw this as a problem. Why? Well, if he says two societies are being created, they're going to fundamentally be at odds with each other. And what could that potentially lead to? Unrest, culminating in civil war, something which conservatives are always willing to avoid. So he says that the wealthy people in society actually need to do more to look after the poorer people, hence One-Nationism, bringing people together. How do we do that? Well, he says one of the key ways we could do that is to engender patriotism. Patriotism is loyalty to one's nation. And he thinks that if we encourage people to be loyal to the nation, understand that they all belong to one country, that's one way of actually encouraging everyone to feel more secure and belong to the nation, hence preventing them from being antithetical to one another, particularly in relation to the rich and the poor. Another way, he says, is by providing basic welfare. And during his tenure and his premiership, we start to see the emergence, the incipient forms of the welfare state, obviously more so catalyzed during the mid-20th century, but its early forms can be seen during the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century also. When you think of the welfare state, very limited reforms started to take place, whereby the wealthy would provide for people who were living in abject poverty. Now, it's quite interesting because a lot of students draw a comparison to one nation conservatism and things like modern liberalism or democratic socialism or social democracy, which is part of the socialist school. What is the actual difference? Now, the actual difference for conservatives is in their understanding of human nature. When a socialist is giving to others, is giving charity, is providing welfare, they're actually doing it to assist others because they believe that they are brothers to them, that they are individuals that they have an obligation towards, in the sense that we live in a society that is communitarian, that is fraternal, that is egalitarian. So they're giving in a way that is both sympathetic and empathetic. But conservatives are very different. Conservatives are somewhat more cynical. When conservatives are giving charity or providing, they're doing it in a paternalistic fashion. What do we mean by paternalism? Well, it's like the relationship between a parent and a child, whereby a parent gives to their child because they're looking after them, they are responsible towards them. One of the key words, a French word, which helps us to understand it, is noblesse oblige, that the nobles are obliged to give those who are poor. And a lot of this is drawn from religious exegesis, like the Bible, for example, whereby, the wealthy should give to the meek and the poor. And this is the same way that they understood their responsibility in society, that we should give to them. But one of the reasons they're giving to them is not just because of charity, which you might say is cynical, because they're receiving reward from God. Another reason why it's cynical is because they're probably thinking to themselves, well, actually, hold on a minute. I'm rich and wealthy and I'm living in this lovely flat. And, it's very pleasurable, it's very pleasant, and I'm living a great life. But if a lot of these people actually become poor, and then they, become poor to such an extent whereby they don't have any food, they don't have shelter, and they don't have the basic necessities to live, at some point they're going to get so annoyed that they're going to rebel. And who are they going to rebel against? Well, they're not going to rebel against each other. They're going to join forces and rebel against the rich and the wealthy. And that's going to be a problem for the aristocratic class. That's going to be a problem for the ruling class. Therefore, the conservatives are at pains to avoid that at any cost. So that's a bit more about One-Nationism and its understanding of conservative ideology. The final school which I'm going to introduce you to is the New Right school. Now, the New Right school is quite different to both traditional conservatism and One-Nationism. And one of the most fundamental ways it's different is its approach to human nature. Very distinct. Whilst traditional and One-Nation conservatives believe that human beings are flawed, are irrational, morally, intellectually, New Right thinkers take an entirely different approach. They're saying that actually human beings are rational. They are objective. So the first thinker we're going to discuss for New Right conservatism is Ayn Rand. She was born in 1905 and died in 82. So she was a contemporary to Michael Oakeshott. She wrote a book called Atlas Shrugged in 1957. She also published The Virtue of Selfishness in 1964. Let's look at some of the main ideas. Rand is saying individuals are rational, and their highest moral purpose is the achievement of personal happiness. She rejected human imperfection and loathed any kind of collectivism because the obligations demanded from individuals eroded their freedom. Now, before we look at explaining that, let me give you a bit of an overview of what the New Right were actually saying. So the New Right emerged largely in terms of policy imposition during the 1970s. You can look at Ronald Reagan, for example, in the United States, and the premiership of Margaret Thatcher right here in the UK. A lot of their policies were geared towards New Right conservatism. The reason that it emerged was because it thought One-Nationism, which emerged after traditional conservatism, had gone way too far. And once again, for those of you who study sociology, there's a great comparison here. I remember when I was studying sociology and I went over the New Right school, I often used to think that I had the wrong textbook because it was so similar to what I was studying in politics. So there are quite significant overlaps between sociology and politics. And the ideas are pretty much the same. And it's why a lot of students like yourselves will be taking sociology and politics together, like I did when I did my A-levels. So as we were saying, New Right are saying, well, look, the One-Nationists have gone way too far. They're providing too much welfare. The state has gone too big. The state has become too expansive. It's time to get a grip of things, and it's time to actually roll the state back. So what that actually meant was that they want to now create a smaller state. Why? Because they're saying that because the state is expanding, too many people are becoming dependent upon the state, and this has created a dependency culture whereby people are thinking to themselves, oh, well, what's the point of going out to work? I'll just apply for welfare and stay at home. What's the point of working hard and buying a property when the council can just provide me one, give me a council house? They say it's creating a lazy society. And once again, like I say, very much links to sociology for those of you who are studying it. Now, in terms of the ideology itself, what they essentially want to achieve is a small state. One-Nationism has expanded the state far too much. It can't even be contained anymore. So what we have to do is actually draw it back, create a minimal state as it was within the traditional school, with its ultimate role being to defend the realm and uphold contract law, but not so much in terms of interference in the everyday quotidian lives of the people. Rand believed that if we do have one-nationism, this creates obligation upon everyone. How so? Well, all of a sudden, we have to pay a lot of taxes. That, for Rand, erodes freedom. Why? Well, say I'm earning a certain amount of money in the United Kingdom, I'm earning a salary, I have to pay 20% to tax, national insurance. That's going to go to the government. Who's it going to be spent upon? Well, people who don't go out to work, people on welfare. A lot of people would argue that that's morally necessary. But Rand is saying, well, why is it necessary? We should be just able to keep that money. And those people who don't get that money would be more so encouraged to go to work now and actually earn for themselves. And that would be better for them, Rand is saying, rather than being dependent upon the state, which encourages them to become fickle and lackadaisical, let's say. So she's saying any kind of collectivism creates obligation upon the rich, which is a bad thing because that in turn erodes freedom. You don't have as much money as you would have if there was no extensive taxation. Therefore, you can't do what you want with your money. And that means you are less free. Money equals freedom. Now, she says that the only real purpose of the state should be to protect individual rights. She talks about an atomistic society made up of individuals. It reminds me of Thatcher's quote that there's no such thing as society. There's only individuals and their families. Very much links to the atomism we're talking about now. She says that individuals have the right to maintain property and income without being taxed for welfare spending. Individuals should maintain their lives through their own efforts, and she opposed state-sponsored welfare provision, favouring voluntarism. It's quite interesting. So instead of the state being this institution where everybody gets taxed, and as you know, those of you who work, you may have small jobs yourself. A lot of you will be working in restaurants, things like that. You'll know that when you get paid through the pay system, you actually get taxed before you get your wages. You don't actually get paid and say and transfer the money to HMRC unless you're self-employed, of course. But a lot of us who are employed, our money goes away to the state before we even say if we want it spent on tax. So she's saying that instead of that, keep all your money and you should instead voluntarily give welfare to people. Like, you know, you might see someone homeless, you might see someone poor, and voluntarily you should be giving to them. But you shouldn't be forced. It should not be coercion by the state, because that is eroding your freedom. You should be free to give. But if you think about it, when we're paying taxes, we're not actually freely giving that, because if you don't pay your taxes, what happens? You will go to prison. So we're not as actually free as we think. And Rand's kind of trying to explicate that in her writings. So she believes in objectivism. Now, this is the notion where individuals who experience negative freedom are best able to comprehend reality and achieve self-realization and self-fulfillment. So let me just quickly explain what we mean by negative freedom. Negative freedom, and we'll study this more in liberalism, so don't worry too much about it. It just means freedom from the state. Another concept is positive freedom, where we have freedom because of interference with the state. Negative freedom is more so, well, the state is not interfering in my life. I'm free to do whatever I want. I'm most free when the state stays away from me, stays at an arm's length. Now, she's saying when the state does stay in that particular position, we are most free. And because we are free, we can achieve self-fulfillment and self-realization. We realize what we really want to do. What does that mean? Well, I understand it as her trying to say, well, look, if you're on welfare, you can't achieve self-fulfillment and self-realization because you're always dependent upon someone else. Namely, nominally, in this case, the state. And we don't want that, because if we are dependent, we can't achieve self-fulfillment because we're always dependent upon someone else. In order to achieve true freedom, we have to be self-sufficient and only dependent on ourselves. The only way to do that is to get up, go outside, work hard for yourself, and make as much money and capital as possible, because that for her equals more freedom for you. Final thing. Rand's neoliberalism, just like Robert Nozick's, the final thinker which we'll discuss in just a few moments, should not be confused with anarchism, which is a complete absence of government. So, just to explain that, Rand is saying that she wants a minimal state, as limited as possible, but she's not saying, as anarchists would say, that she wants no state. She's somewhat advocating a classical liberal ideology, which is why we say that neoliberalism brings in ideas of classical liberalism and traditional conservatism. But that also, there's a bit of a caveat to that as well, because Rand wasn't really a traditional conservative. And let me tell you why. Because when she was writing, homosexuality and things like abortion were actually outlawed in America, but she was actually advocating for them under the auspices, under the ideology of freedom. that individuals should be able to decide whether they want to be homosexual or not. And women should be able to decide if they want to have an abortion or not. If that is conducive to their freedom, then they should be allowed to do that. It's not the preserve of the state. It's not the state's prerogative to decide if that should be the case. So, still believes in the importance of maintaining a small state. The reason for that is that it would maintain individual freedoms and rights and liberties and also defend borders. Kind of going back to traditional conservatism and its view of the state. So a good comparison there if you're doing your analysis, making your AO2 points. Now, the spec here makes somewhat of an outlier point, which is not entirely relevant, but could be mentioned. She did espouse somewhat of a racist ideology. She belittled the rights of Native Americans, and her ideas have been somewhat used to justify white supremacy. Now, in terms of using that in your examination, I don't think it's entirely useful, but it's good to know in terms of how that individual thinker constructed their ideology. So it might be useful somewhere, but not necessarily as much as the things I've said previously. So the final thinker we want to look at is Robert Nozick. He was born in 1938, died in 2002, and his book was Anarchy, State and Utopia. Quite similar to the ideals and principles of Ayn Rand. So he basically said that the government should be monarchist in nature. It should have minimal interference in society, and that is the best way to make society conducive to the well-being of everyone. And once again, similar to Ayn Rand, he says that the state's primary function is to protect individual human rights. Now, Nozick's ideas began as a rebuttal of John Rawls' modern liberal ideals, who's a liberal thinker. He argued that the state forcibly taxing the rich violated their intrinsic freedoms, and governments had no right to encroach upon the rights of individuals by taking their money and giving it to others. So very similar to what Rand was saying, that the government shouldn't forcibly tax people and then imprison those who don't want to pay that tax just to give it to other people to live their lives. So that, in a nutshell, is what Nozick was saying. Very similar to what Rand was saying, which is why the section on him is actually quite small in the specification. So I've given you there a very fundamental, very holistic, and very rooted, I would say, overview of all the political thinkers for conservatism. I really do hope you found that useful for your studies. I, of course, assist students like yourselves who are probably watching this with their studies for politics, A-level, GCSE, and sociology. So if you do need help, please do get in touch with me. I'll be more than willing to assist you. I offer private tutoring and have been doing so for a number of years. All of my students end up with either an A star or an A, and many of them have gone on to study at Oxbridge themselves. And I think that's a phenomenal achievement, so please do make sure that you take advantage of that from me. I'll be more than willing to assist you. It will be in the description below. And yeah, if you found these useful, please do like, subscribe and share them with your friends. If there's any things that you think I missed out or that things that could be improved upon for the next video, please do drop those hints and I'll be more than willing to have a look at them and incorporate them in the next video. But yeah, here's to you guys, hopefully getting an A star, and I will see you in the next video where we'll be discussing socialism. So make sure you keep an eye out for that. Thank you very much.